Did he leave you anything at all? Brittany asked softly at my husband's funeral reception, her voice wrapped in sympathy so perfect it almost sounded rehearsed. And I remember looking at her over the rim of my coffee cup and thinking how strange it was that she asked about money before she asked how I was sleeping at night. George Hayes had been my husband for 43 years, and the house still smelled like the lemon polish he used every Sunday morning, the same polish he insisted made the oak floors shine like the day we bought the place back in 1989. Everyone told me I was strong during the funeral. They said things like, "Margaret, you're handling this better than most people would," and I nodded politely because that's what people expect from a 68-year-old widow who has lived long enough to understand that grief doesn't need an audience. What none of them knew was that 3 days earlier I had sat in a quiet office across from George's attorney, a gray-haired man named Mr. Caldwell who had known my husband longer than I had known some of my own cousins, and he had slid a sealed envelope across the desk toward me as carefully as if it contained something fragile. "Your husband asked that you open this in private," he said. I remember the sound the envelope made when I tore it open, that soft paper rip that seems small at the time but somehow divides life into before and after. Inside was a letter written in George's careful handwriting and a document that changed everything I thought I understood about our future. $8 million. That was the number printed clearly across the page. The amount George had arranged to leave entirely to me through investments and insurance policies he had never once mentioned during all the evenings we spent sitting together on the back porch watching the sun drop behind the maple trees. $8 million. I sat there in the lawyer's office for a long time after reading it, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of traffic outside, wondering why George had kept something so large a secret. But the truth is, George always believed people reveal themselves when they think no one is watching, and as I folded the paper and slipped it back into the envelope, I could almost hear his voice telling me not to rush into anything. So I thanked Mr. Caldwell, placed the envelope in my purse, and drove home to the quiet house where every clock suddenly sounded louder than it used to. The funeral came 2 days later, and the living room filled with neighbors bringing casseroles and relatives telling stories about George's fishing trips and terrible jokes. Luke stood near the window greeting people, tall like his father but somehow softer in ways I never expected, while Brittany stayed close to him with her hand resting gently on his arm, smiling with that warm, polished expression she always used in public. She hugged me more than once that afternoon, her perfume sharp and sweet, telling me over and over that she and Luke would make sure I was never alone. But every time she stepped back, her eyes drifted slowly across the room, pausing on the framed photographs, the antique cabinet George restored himself, the wide staircase leading upstairs, and something in that look made me remember the envelope sitting quietly in the bottom of my purse. Later that evening, after most of the guests had gone and the house finally fell silent again, Luke and Brittany stayed behind to help wash dishes in the kitchen. I stood in the hallway for a moment listening to the sound of plates touching and the low murmur of their voices. "The house is beautiful," Brittany said at one point, her tone thoughtful in a way that had nothing to do with memories. Luke replied quietly, "Dad loved this place." Then Brittany asked the question that stayed with me long after the dishes were dry. "Do you know if he left a will?" she said, her voice casual but precise, like someone testing the water before stepping in. I felt the envelope in my purse again, heavy and silent. And in that moment I made a decision that would change everything that happened afterward. I wasn't going to tell them about the $8 million George had left me. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Instead, I walked into the kitchen with the same calm smile people had seen all day, picked up a towel, and started drying the last plate while Brittany continued talking about how complicated finances can be after someone passes away. She spoke kindly, almost helpfully, but I noticed how carefully she watched my face every time the conversation touched on money or the house. I simply nodded and said I hadn't looked through most of George's paperwork yet. That was true in a way. I hadn't looked through it with anyone else in mind. Because as I stood there in the warm light of the kitchen, listening to my son and his wife talk quietly about the future, I realized something that George must have understood long before I did. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can inherit isn't money. Sometimes it's the chance to see people exactly as they are. I slept very little during the first week after George passed away, not because the house was unfamiliar but because it suddenly felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound seem important. The refrigerator hummed. The old clock in the hallway clicked steadily with each passing second. And every once in a while I caught myself listening for George's footsteps coming down the stairs in the early morning the way he used to when he could not sleep. But the house stayed silent, and eventually the quiet became something else entirely. It became space. 3 days after the funeral, Luke and Brittany came by again in the late afternoon carrying grocery bags and a bouquet of yellow flowers that Brittany said would brighten the kitchen table. She spoke gently, always gently, the way people do when they want to look kind in front of others. Luke hugged me when he walked in and asked how I was doing, and I told him the truth in the simplest way possible. I said that some mornings felt heavier than others but that I was managing. That word managing seemed to interest Brittany more than anything else I said. While Luke placed the groceries on the counter, she began opening cabinets as if she had lived there for years, organizing things that had never needed organizing before. She rearranged the tea boxes. She moved the cereal to a different shelf. She wiped a perfectly clean counter with a paper towel as if searching for something to do while her eyes quietly examined the kitchen. I watched all of it without saying a word. George used to tell me that silence reveals more than questions, and I was beginning to understand what he meant. After a few minutes, Brittany leaned against the counter and said something that sounded helpful on the surface. She said that dealing with finances after losing someone could be overwhelming and that she and Luke wanted to make sure everything was handled properly. She spoke carefully, choosing each word as if it had already been rehearsed in her mind. Luke nodded along with her suggestion and said that there might be bills or paperwork that needed attention and that they would be happy to help sort through it. I dried my hands with a towel and thanked them both for caring. Then I told them that George had always kept things simple and that there was not much to worry about. That was not entirely a lie. George had kept things simple for them. Just not for me. Brittany asked another question then, and this time her tone carried a curiosity she did not quite manage to hide. She asked whether George had any insurance policies or investments that I might need assistance managing. I noticed that Luke looked at her before he looked at me, and that small moment stayed with me longer than her question itself. I smiled the way people expect widows to smile when they are trying to remain brave. I told them that George had always been careful but that most of our savings were modest and that I planned to take my time before making any big decisions. Brittany nodded slowly as if processing the information, though something about the way her eyes narrowed slightly made me believe she was calculating rather than understanding. We sat down at the kitchen table a few minutes later with cups of coffee, and the conversation turned to the house itself. Luke mentioned that it must feel large with only one person living there now. He said it gently, almost apologetically, but Brittany leaned forward slightly as if the topic interested her. She asked whether I had ever thought about downsizing someday, perhaps moving to a smaller place closer to town where things might be easier to manage. I looked out the window at the backyard where George had built the wooden swing for our grandson years ago, and I told them that the house had many memories but that I would think about everything slowly. That seemed to satisfy them for the moment, yet I noticed Brittany studying the staircase, the hallway, the living room, as if measuring something invisible in her mind. When they left later that evening, Luke hugged me again and promised they would come by often to help with anything I needed. Brittany smiled warmly and said that family always takes care of each other. I stood in the doorway and watched their car disappear down the street before closing the door and returning to the quiet kitchen. The envelope was still in my purse where I had placed it days earlier. $8 million rested inside it, silent and patient. I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat down at the table where Brittany had just been sitting. That was the moment I realized something important. People behave very differently when they believe there is nothing to gain. And for the first time since George passed away, I understood why he had trusted me to keep the truth hidden a little while longer. The next week passed slowly, the way time often moves when a house holds more memories than voices. I kept my routine simple because routines make quiet days feel steady. Every morning I made coffee the same way George used to, measuring the grounds carefully and letting the smell fill the kitchen before the sun had fully risen. Sometimes I sat at the table and watched the light stretch across the wooden floor he had polished so many Sundays. Other times I walked through the rooms just to remind myself that the house was still mine. Luke called every couple of days to check on me, and each call sounded almost identical to the one before it. He asked if I had eaten well, if I had slept, if I needed anything from the store. His voice was warm, but I noticed something else now that I had not paid attention to before. Almost every conversation eventually drifted toward practical matters. Bills. Repairs. Insurance. The sort of topics that sound responsible but also reveal what people are truly thinking about. Brittany did not call as often, but when she did her questions were always very specific. One afternoon she asked if I had started going through George's paperwork yet. She said that financial matters could become complicated if they were ignored too long. I thanked her for the concern and told her I was taking things one step at a time. That answer seemed to linger in the air between us for a moment before she politely changed the subject. A few days later they came by again for dinner. Luke brought a rotisserie chicken from the grocery store and Brittany carried a salad in a clear container, and we sat together at the same dining table where George had carved the Thanksgiving turkey for more than 30 years. At first the conversation stayed light. Luke talked about work and a new project his company had started. Brittany mentioned a friend who had recently moved to a smaller home closer to the city and said the change had made life much easier for her. She told the story with a pleasant smile, but the way she glanced toward the hallway and staircase told me the story was not really about her friend at all. I listened quietly while cutting my chicken into small pieces, letting the conversation unfold naturally. Brittany eventually leaned back in her chair and said something that sounded thoughtful on the surface. She said that large houses can become difficult to manage as people get older, especially when maintenance and property taxes continue to rise every year. She added that many people choose to sell at the right time and move somewhere more convenient before things become overwhelming. Luke nodded slowly as if he had heard the idea before. I looked at him then, not with anger but with curiosity, because there was a moment when he avoided meeting my eyes. I asked them calmly if they believed the house was too much for me. Brittany answered quickly, saying that they only wanted what was best for my comfort and security. She said that downsizing could free up money and reduce stress. The word money hung in the room longer than any of the others. I thanked them again for caring and said that I had managed the house with George for decades and that I felt comfortable continuing to live there for now. My voice was gentle but steady. Luke shifted slightly in his chair and said that they would support whatever decision made me happiest. Brittany smiled, though the smile seemed thinner than before. After dinner Luke carried the plates to the sink and Brittany began wiping the table even though it was already clean. I watched her movements carefully because they reminded me of someone waiting for information that had not yet appeared. Before they left Brittany paused near the doorway and looked once more toward the living room and staircase. Then she turned back to me with the same warm tone she always used and said that families should always help each other make wise decisions about the future. I thanked her and wished them a safe drive home. When their car finally disappeared down the street I closed the door and walked slowly through the quiet living room. The envelope was still hidden safely in my bedroom drawer. $8 million remained untouched, silent as ever. I sat down in George's old armchair and realized that something subtle had begun to change. Their visits were becoming less about comfort and more about possibilities. And the longer I remained silent about the truth, the clearer those possibilities seemed to become. I began to notice the pattern during the third week after George passed away, and once I saw it I could not unsee it. Luke and Brittany visited more often now, but the visits had a different rhythm than before. They stayed a little longer in the living room. Their eyes traveled more slowly across the walls, the shelves, the staircase. It was subtle, the kind of change most people would never mention out loud, but silence has a way of sharpening the smallest details. One Saturday afternoon they arrived with coffee and pastries from the bakery near their neighborhood, and Brittany placed the white box carefully on the kitchen table as if it were a thoughtful surprise. She said she wanted to make sure I was eating well because she knew the first weeks after losing someone could be difficult. I thanked her sincerely because kindness deserves to be acknowledged even when it carries another purpose behind it. We sat together while the afternoon sun warmed the window above the sink, and Luke talked about the weather turning colder earlier than expected that year. Brittany listened quietly for a few minutes before shifting the conversation in a way that felt almost effortless. She mentioned a couple she knew who had recently sold their house for much more than they expected because property values in our area had increased significantly over the last few years. She said it with a light tone, almost like an interesting story someone might mention during casual conversation. I nodded politely and took a small sip of coffee. Then she added that sometimes people wait too long to make decisions about large homes and miss opportunities they did not realize were there. Luke did not say anything immediately, but I noticed the quick glance he gave her before turning back toward me. The glance lasted less than a second, but it was enough to tell me the conversation had already happened between them somewhere else. Brittany leaned forward slightly and asked whether I had ever considered what the house might be worth now compared to when George and I first bought it. I told her honestly that I had never paid much attention to market prices because George had always believed a home should be valued by the life inside it rather than the number attached to it. She smiled politely at that answer, though her eyes drifted again toward the hallway and the staircase that led to the second floor where the bedrooms were. After a few minutes Luke stood up and said he would take a quick look at the backyard because he had noticed the fence leaning slightly the last time he visited. I watched him step outside through the back door, leaving Brittany and me alone at the table. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she rested her hands together on the table and said something that sounded careful but direct. She said that sometimes older homes require more maintenance than people expect and that selling at the right time can prevent a lot of stress later. Her voice remained calm, almost helpful, but the words themselves carried a quiet weight. I looked at her and asked gently if she believed I could not take care of the house. She quickly shook her head and said that was not what she meant at all. She said she only wanted to make sure I had support and options because families should help each other think about the future. The word future seemed to echo in the room for a moment. When Luke returned from the backyard he mentioned that the fence might need a small repair in the spring but that everything else looked solid. Brittany nodded as if she had expected that answer. Then she began gathering the empty coffee cups and folding the pastry box closed. Before they left she stood near the front door and looked around the living room once more, the same thoughtful look crossing her face that I had begun to recognize. Luke hugged me and said they would come by again next weekend to help with anything I might need around the house. I thanked them both and watched their car drive away down the quiet street. After the sound of the engine disappeared I walked slowly back into the living room and sat in George's armchair. The house felt peaceful again, but the conversations from the past few weeks remained clear in my mind. They were not rushing. They were not demanding anything directly. Instead they were planting small ideas, one at a time, like seeds placed carefully into soil. And as I sat there listening to the steady ticking of the hallway clock, I realized that the longer I allowed them to believe I had very little money, the more those ideas would continue to grow. By the fourth week the conversations were no longer subtle suggestions scattered between polite words. They were becoming clearer, more organized, almost like a plan slowly assembling itself piece by piece. Luke and Brittany arrived one evening just before sunset carrying a folder and a small notebook along with the usual grocery bag Brittany liked to bring whenever she visited. She said the bag contained soup she had made at home because she knew warm food helped people feel better during difficult times. I thanked her and placed the container in the refrigerator while Luke stood quietly near the kitchen island, his hands resting on the counter the way George used to stand when he was thinking about something he had not yet decided how to say. The three of us sat down at the table after a few minutes, and for a while the conversation stayed harmless. Luke talked about a meeting he had at work earlier that week. Brittany mentioned that the holidays were approaching faster than expected and that stores were already decorating their windows. But then she opened the folder she had brought with her and slid a sheet of paper across the table toward me. The paper showed a list of houses that had recently sold in our neighborhood. The prices were printed in bold numbers that immediately drew attention. Brittany explained that she had been curious about the housing market and thought it might be helpful for us to know how much homes in our area were worth now. She spoke carefully, her voice friendly and calm, but the word helpful carried a quiet intention that was impossible to miss. Luke nodded as she talked, though he mostly kept his eyes on the table. I studied the paper slowly, not because the numbers surprised me but because I wanted to understand exactly how far this conversation was going to go. Brittany pointed to one of the listings and said the house had fewer bedrooms than mine yet sold for more than $700,000 only 2 months earlier. She added that properties with larger yards, like ours, sometimes attracted even higher offers. When she finished explaining the numbers, she leaned back slightly and folded her hands together as if waiting for my reaction. I placed the paper back on the table and said that it was interesting to see how much the area had changed over the years. Then I asked why she had decided to research these listings in the first place. Brittany hesitated for a brief moment before answering. She said she only wanted to help me understand the options available if I ever decided to move somewhere smaller and more convenient. Luke finally looked up then and added that they would be happy to assist with anything if I ever wanted to consider selling the house. His voice was gentle, but the words sounded practiced, as if they had been discussed many times before arriving in my kitchen that evening. I smiled calmly and told them I appreciated their concern, though I was not planning to make any decisions quickly. The house had been part of my life for more than 3 decades, and rushing would not feel right. Brittany nodded again, though her expression seemed slightly tighter than before. She said that waiting too long could sometimes make things more complicated, especially when maintenance costs and property taxes continued to rise each year. I told her I understood her point and promised I would think about everything carefully. After that, the conversation drifted back to lighter topics, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be undone. When Luke stood to wash the dishes, he moved quietly, avoiding my eyes the way people sometimes do when they feel caught between loyalty and pressure. Brittany remained seated at the table, glancing once more at the paper with the house prices before sliding it neatly back into the folder. When they left later that evening, Luke hugged me with the same warmth he had always shown since he was a boy, yet something about the hug felt different now, as if another voice existed somewhere behind his thoughts guiding the direction of our conversations. I closed the door after their car disappeared down the street and returned to the kitchen where the paper with the housing prices had briefly rested on the table. The surface was empty again, but the meaning behind that sheet of paper remained clear. They were no longer simply discussing possibilities. They were building momentum toward a decision they hoped I would eventually accept. And as I stood there in the quiet house George and I had shared for so many years, I realized something important about the envelope hidden safely in my bedroom drawer. The more convinced they became that I had only modest savings, the more confidently they revealed what they truly wanted. The following week brought a colder wind that moved through the maple trees in the backyard and scattered yellow leaves across the grass George used to mow every Saturday morning. I spent most of my time keeping the house the way it had always been, not out of stubbornness but because routine has a quiet strength that helps steady the mind. I swept the porch, watered the small plants in the kitchen window, and walked through each room the same way I had done for decades. Yet every now and then I noticed myself listening more carefully for the sound of a car slowing near the driveway. Luke and Brittany had begun visiting with a purpose now, and even though they never said it directly, the direction of those visits had become easier to recognize. One afternoon they arrived earlier than usual. Luke stepped inside first, carrying a toolbox he said he had brought in case anything around the house needed a small repair. Brittany followed him holding 2 cups of coffee from the cafe near their neighborhood. She handed one to me with a warm smile and said she thought I might enjoy a change from my usual morning routine. We sat in the living room for a while, the 3 of us facing the large window that looked out toward the backyard. The air felt calm at first, but after a few minutes Brittany began another one of the conversations that had become familiar over the past weeks. She mentioned that a coworker of hers had recently helped his mother move into a smaller condominium closer to town. According to Brittany, the move had made the woman's life far easier because she no longer had to manage a large property alone. Luke nodded slowly as Brittany spoke, though he remained mostly quiet. I listened without interrupting, noticing the careful rhythm of Brittany's voice and the way she watched my reaction between sentences. Eventually she turned slightly toward me and asked if I had thought any more about what we discussed the last time they visited. Her tone sounded patient, but the question itself was direct. I answered calmly that I had considered everything they mentioned and that I still felt comfortable staying in the house for now. The words were simple, yet the room grew noticeably quieter after I spoke them. Brittany took a small sip of her coffee before continuing. She said she completely respected my decision, though she worried that maintaining the house alone might become overwhelming as the years passed. Then she added something new. She said that if I sold the property while the market was strong I could use the money to secure a comfortable future somewhere easier to manage. I asked what she meant by secure, and she explained that many older people choose retirement communities where maintenance, utilities, and safety are all handled for them. Luke shifted slightly in his seat at that point and finally spoke again. He said they would always want me close to them but that professional communities sometimes provide better support for daily living. I nodded slowly while listening, though inside I recognized the direction the conversation was moving. The suggestion of a smaller home had now become the suggestion of a different kind of living arrangement entirely. Brittany continued speaking gently, describing places she had read about where residents enjoyed shared activities, medical support nearby, and neighbors of similar age. She made the idea sound peaceful and practical, the kind of place someone might choose willingly if they believed their life had already grown smaller. When she finished explaining everything she looked at me carefully and asked what I thought about the possibility. I paused for a moment before answering because silence often reveals more than quick responses. Finally, I told them that George and I had spent many years building our life in this house and that leaving it so soon after his passing did not feel right to me. Luke looked down at his hands while Brittany nodded slowly as if accepting the answer, though the thoughtful expression on her face suggested she had not given up on the idea. A few minutes later Luke stood up and said he would take a look at the back gate since the wind had been strong the past few days. Brittany remained seated beside me while he stepped outside, and for a moment neither of us spoke. She stared toward the staircase that led to the bedrooms upstairs before quietly saying that sometimes people need encouragement to make decisions that protect their future. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I simply looked toward the hallway clock and listened to its steady ticking. Because by then I understood something very clearly. They believed they were guiding me toward a better life. What they did not realize was that every suggestion they made was revealing exactly how they imagined that life would look once the house was no longer mine. By the time the first frost settled across the lawn that year, I had learned something important about patience. Patience allows people to reveal themselves without realizing they are doing it. Over the next several days Luke and Brittany continued their visits, but the tone of those visits had changed in a way that was now impossible to ignore. They were no longer only suggesting ideas. They were beginning to build a story about what my future should look like. One Sunday afternoon they arrived carrying groceries again, though this time Brittany also brought a glossy brochure folded neatly inside her purse. She placed it on the coffee table after we sat down in the living room. The brochure showed photographs of a quiet residential community about 40 miles outside the city. The buildings were bright and clean, surrounded by walking paths and small gardens. Brittany opened the brochure and pointed to a page that described organized activities, weekly dinners, transportation services, and medical assistance available nearby. She spoke about the place as if she had already imagined me living there, describing the calm atmosphere and the way residents could enjoy a simpler life without worrying about maintaining a large home. Luke listened quietly beside her, occasionally adding a small comment about how convenient the location seemed. I studied the brochure carefully, not because I was considering the idea but because I wanted to understand how far their plan had developed. Brittany said she had heard about the community from a colleague at work whose aunt lived there and loved the peaceful environment. She explained that places like this often had waiting lists and that planning early was always wise. Then she looked directly at me and asked if I could imagine enjoying a place like that, somewhere smaller, quieter, and easier to manage. I placed the brochure back on the table and answered gently that the photographs were lovely but that I still felt connected to the house George and I had shared for so many years. My voice remained calm, yet I could see the faint shadow of disappointment cross Brittany's face before she quickly replaced it with a polite smile. Luke leaned forward slightly and said that he understood how strong memories could be, but he also believed people sometimes needed help letting go of places that had become too large for them. The room grew quiet for a moment after he said that. I looked at my son and saw the boy he used to be when he ran through this very living room carrying toy airplanes and asking George endless questions about how engines worked. That memory made his words feel both familiar and distant at the same time. Brittany broke the silence by explaining that selling the house could provide financial flexibility for the future. She spoke carefully, almost thoughtfully, describing how the money from a property like this could support a comfortable lifestyle for many years. I listened without interrupting, though I knew something they did not. The house, valuable as it might be, was only a small piece of the truth hidden quietly in my bedroom drawer. After another few minutes, Luke stood up and walked toward the window, looking out across the backyard where the maple leaves had now turned a deep shade of red. He said the yard had always been beautiful but that maintaining it alone could become tiring over time. Brittany nodded in agreement and added that professional communities often take care of landscaping and repairs so residents can simply enjoy their days. I thanked them both for thinking about my well-being and told them I would consider everything carefully. That answer seemed to satisfy them for the moment, though I could tell they believed time was on their side. When they finally gathered their things to leave, Brittany folded the brochure neatly and left it on the coffee table as if placing it there might allow the idea to settle more comfortably into my mind. After their car disappeared down the street, I remained seated in the living room, staring quietly at the brochure they had left behind. The photographs showed peaceful gardens and bright hallways filled with smiling residents. To someone who believed their future depended entirely on the value of a house, it might have looked like a safe and practical choice. But as the evening light faded through the windows, I realized that Luke and Brittany had already begun imagining my life in a place far away from this home. What they had not yet imagined was the moment when the truth about the $8 million would quietly change every expectation they had built. 2 days later, the sky turned gray and a steady rain began to fall across the neighborhood, the kind of quiet autumn rain that makes every sound softer and every room inside the house feel warmer. I spent that afternoon sitting near the kitchen window with a cup of tea, watching the water slide slowly down the glass while thinking about the conversations that had become so common over the past few weeks. Luke and Brittany believed they were moving carefully, but to someone who had spent more than 60 years observing people, their intentions were becoming clearer each time they visited. Later that evening, Luke called to ask if they could stop by for a short visit. His voice sounded polite and casual, yet something in the way he asked told me that another conversation was waiting just beneath the surface. When they arrived, Brittany carried a small box of pastries from a bakery across town. She said the shop had just opened recently and she wanted me to try their cinnamon rolls. We sat around the dining table the same way we had many times before, though the air between us now carried a quiet tension that none of us mentioned out loud. For a few minutes the conversation stayed light. Luke spoke about work again, and Brittany described a new project she was managing at her office. But eventually Brittany reached into her purse and removed a folded sheet of paper that looked far more serious than a bakery receipt. She placed it gently on the table and slid it toward me. The page showed printed information about the same retirement community they had mentioned before, but this time there were notes written along the margins in Brittany's careful handwriting. She explained that she had contacted the community earlier that week to ask about availability and pricing. According to her notes, several apartments would become available early the following spring. She spoke with the same calm tone she always used, describing how comfortable the apartments were and how residents often formed close friendships with their neighbors. Luke listened beside her, occasionally nodding as she talked. I studied the paper slowly, noticing that Brittany had even written small reminders about the steps required to reserve a unit. She had clearly spent time organizing the information before bringing it to my house that evening. After she finished explaining everything, she looked up and asked what I thought about placing my name on the waiting list while there was still time to secure a spot. I rested my hands on the table and answered carefully that I appreciated the effort she had made gathering the information, but I still felt that leaving the house so soon after George's passing would be difficult for me. Luke sighed quietly, not in anger but in a way that suggested growing frustration. He said he only wanted to make sure I was safe and comfortable in the years ahead. Brittany added that large homes sometimes become overwhelming for people living alone, especially when unexpected repairs appear. Her words were gentle, yet there was now a firmness behind them that had not existed before. I thanked them again for their concern and told them I would think about everything they had said, though my voice remained calm and steady. The truth was that every new conversation only strengthened my decision to stay quiet about the inheritance George had left me. As long as Luke and Brittany believed my future depended entirely on this house, they continued revealing exactly how they imagined the next chapter of my life unfolding. When they left later that evening, Brittany folded the paper neatly and placed it back in her purse, though the look she exchanged with Luke near the door told me they would return to this subject again soon. After the house grew quiet, I walked upstairs and opened the small drawer beside my bed where the envelope still rested safely inside. I did not remove it or read the documents again. I simply closed the drawer and stood there for a moment, realizing that the rain outside had begun to fall more heavily against the roof. Somewhere downstairs the clock in the hallway continued its steady ticking, marking each passing minute in the same calm rhythm it had kept for years. And as I listened to that quiet sound echo through the house, I understood something with complete certainty. Luke and Brittany believed they were guiding me toward a future they thought was sensible and practical. What they did not realize was that the moment the truth about $8 million finally appeared, the entire story they had been building would begin to fall apart. I realized the moment had to come soon. Not because I wanted a confrontation, but because the quiet assumptions Luke and Brittany had been building around my life were becoming stronger with every visit. One clear Saturday morning near the beginning of winter, I invited them over for lunch. The sky was bright and the cold air carried that crisp feeling that always reminded me of the first holidays George and I spent in this house decades ago. I prepared a simple meal the way I always had: roasted chicken, warm vegetables, and fresh bread from the market down the street. When Luke and Brittany arrived, they seemed surprised by the invitation, though Brittany quickly smiled and said it was nice to see me in such good spirits. We sat together at the dining table, sunlight falling across the wood surface where so many family meals had taken place over the years. For the first half hour, the conversation stayed relaxed. Luke talked about a new project at work and Brittany mentioned that the holiday decorations in town had already started appearing in store windows. But I could tell they were both waiting for the same thing they had been waiting for during every visit. Eventually Brittany asked, in that careful tone she had perfected, whether I had given any more thought to the retirement community they had mentioned. I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate and looked at both of them calmly. Then I said something that caused the room to become very still. I told them that I had indeed been thinking about my future and that I had already taken several steps to make sure everything was properly arranged. Luke leaned forward slightly, curiosity appearing in his expression. Brittany watched me closely, clearly expecting me to say that I was ready to begin selling the house. Instead, I stood up from the table and walked quietly to the hallway cabinet where I kept several important documents. Inside the cabinet was the same envelope that had rested in my bedroom drawer for weeks before that day. I returned to the table and placed the envelope in front of me. Neither Luke nor Brittany spoke as I opened it. The papers inside were official documents from the attorney who had handled George's estate. I slid one of the pages across the table so they could see it clearly. The number printed near the center of the document was simple and unmistakable. $8 million. Luke stared at the page for several seconds before looking back up at me. Brittany blinked twice, her calm expression slowly giving way to something closer to shock. I explained quietly that George had arranged the investment years earlier and that the inheritance had been transferred to my name shortly after his passing. I told them that I had kept the information private because I wanted time to think about my future without pressure from anyone else. The room remained silent for a long moment after I finished speaking. Finally, Luke asked why I had not mentioned the inheritance before. His voice sounded confused rather than angry. I answered honestly that I needed to understand who was concerned about my happiness and who was concerned about my house. Brittany looked down at the table, her fingers resting motionless beside the empty dessert plate. I continued speaking calmly, explaining that the house was not something I needed to sell in order to feel secure. My future was already secure because of the inheritance George had left behind. What mattered now was choosing how I wanted to live, not how someone else believed I should live. Luke leaned back slowly in his chair as the meaning of my words settled into the quiet dining room. Outside the window, the cold winter sunlight stretched across the backyard where the maple tree stood bare and still. And for the first time since George had passed away, the conversation about my future finally belonged to me alone.